Hello, I'm Jason Ball, News Director at KTLA 5 News in Los Angeles, and this is the News Director's Office. I am joined by Bobby as usual. Bobby, you all good today?
I'm good. I think this is the earliest we've ever done one of these podcasts. I usually have water, but today I have my coffee, which is new.
It feels early to me too, but that's okay. Our guest is in the East Coast, so he's it's late morning there. So our guest today is Mark Joyella, writer, content creator at IBM, senior contributor to Forbes, mental illness advocate, former TV reporter, and friend of mine for more than 20 years. Mark Joyella, how are you?
Wow, that's a big intro. It's good to be here, Jason. It's so much fun. I'm really, when you asked me, I was like, wow, who canceled? But I'm very flattered.
No, I've been following you all these. I guess we really probably haven't seen each other in a long time, but I've been following you on Twitter and your career, and I think you've had an interesting trajectory since I've known you. So let's get caught up.
Yeah, I mean, so we worked together in Miami, and actually I did 2 tours at WPLG in Miami. I worked there with you for 4 years, left, went to New York City, and then went back and did another tour. And then after that, I got married, came back to New York, bounced around a little bit. I worked at CNN as a digital producer, and then got called back to local news again, and went to Orlando as a weekend morning anchor, and then eventually, that was my last local news job, and since then I've gotten into this weird world of working for massive company with which is something I never would have anticipated doing. If you had told me 10 years ago you'll end up working at IBM, I would have thought, how does that make any sense in the world? There's no way that would work. But the funny thing is they actually were looking to hire somebody with TV experience, because for a short period of time, a few years ago, they were looking to have a sort of an internal TV channel. Oh. And so the interviews were set up. I go in, and by the time I went in, the plan had changed. There wasn't going to be any TV thing. But I got hired anyway. And the funny thing is now they do have a newscast that they do once a week. And so I'm one of the co-anchors of the IBMer News TV. And the funny thing is I hear from people from around the company, and they go, wow, you're really good. You seem like a real broadcaster. I'm like, well, I don't know. I've done it a bit,
Yeah, so we first met in 1998 when I had been in WPLG in Miami for a couple of years, I guess, maybe a year and a half when you came in. And I just remember you were this confident, great reporter, and we could put you on any story, and I actually remember one of the stories you did, such a quirky little thing. They printed the phone book and they misprinted the area code on all the phone. Do you remember this story?
It sounds like something that I would cover. Yeah.
And we did a whole story on it. I don't think it was 305, but it was one of them. Maybe it was like 350 that they had misprinted the series of the phone books on. And you did this kind of tongue-in-cheek fun thing on it. But it was we could put you on those kind of quirky things, and you would not go, I'm not doing that, or what am I supposed to do, or whatever. You'd figure out a way to do it, which I always think is one of the greatest skills of being a TV reporter, is you can literally talk about anything for 2 minutes.
Yeah, I go and I lecture to college journalism classes a lot, and I tell them sometimes that one of the curses that I had was that producers like yourself would back in the day when you were a producer, not to demote you in any way, but they would think he can handle it. He can take this story that has no video, no facts, no anything, and somehow he can make that a lead story. So you get that story. So I would always get the stories where there's nothing here. It's like the phone book was misprinted. What are we doing with that? I don't know, but you're the lead of the 5:30. So, right. And so I'd say, it's good to have producers like you in that way, to feel confident that, you can go out into the field and come back with something strong enough to lead a newscast. But sometimes after a while, you're like, why am I always getting these stories? I mean, I also got a story in Miami. I remember it was something like they mispainted the stripes on the street or something. And I had always joked about, I can package a street sign if you ask me to. I mean, I can do it. And I was like, wait, we're actually doing that story now. This is like, they mispainted that. It was like, no bus crossing or something, but it was misspelled. And I was like, man, this is like, I don't know, maybe I need to rethink things here for a bit.
Did that give you, I mean, we just assume, he can do anything. Like, super reporter, you can literally assign him anything. But that wasn't really your experience. You saw it as a challenge, or you saw it as like, why am I getting these weird stories?
No, I mean, sometimes, I think it was fine. I mean, I liked that I liked being liked. You always want to feel like people think you are talented, and people feel that you are somebody they can count on, and people feel that you don't need to be babysat through the whole day. They'd be like, go do it. And nobody calls, nobody checks on me. Nobody says, are you sure? Nobody says, can I talk to you about the interview questions you asked? There's a lot of confidence. And so that's a good thing. It's just at other times you're like, how come I can't have the fabulous story with the great, hidden camera video, or the surveillance video that has everything. And, there's going to be a news conference at 2:00 with the family, and all the elements are going to be there. But that, at the same time, I think it's for my career, I think what was really important to me was the relationship and the trust between the people I worked with and myself. And so that was always most important to me. And that's the other thing I always tell students is, I talk to them about always making slot, like don't ever fail in that way, because once you do one time, producer will never trust you again to be the lead of their show. Because if you crash their show, they're not going to ever forget that. However, if everything falls apart, you can't do it. The thing that your live truck breaks, the interview goes bad, all things fall apart. Just call, 2 minutes of air and say, I can't we're not going to have the story, but I could go in front of a camera and just do the whole story for you live. Or we can do the story later and I'll get it done. Or just tell me what you want and I'll do it. They don't remember that part. But if they're expecting a story and it doesn't happen, they never forget that. And so I always tell them, it's like, just make sure that they know that they can trust you, and you will do very well.
That's true. Reporters always think, one slot, you miss slot one time and you're, marked with that. But then reporters never remember that one time they miss slot. Like, I've heard reporters, I never miss slot. You miss slot all the time.
Did I?
It's perspective. No, you didn't. You were even here 5 minutes early for this record. So,
yeah,
is that where you got your name, Stand Up Kid?
No, that was like so funny. That was like
so your Twitter handle is Stand Up Kid.
Yeah, and that I was trying to get stand up guy or whatever, stand up man, whatever the phrase is. He's a stand up guy.
Yeah.
And it wasn't available. And then it was like, stand up man, and I ended up like punching other things in, stand up dude, like all these things, and nothing's working. And then it's like stand up kid. I'm like, okay, fine. And now I'm like a little old for that, but it's like sort of associated with me, so I guess I'm keeping it.
Yeah I like it. I think it's fun. It reminds me of exactly who you are, and it seems perfect for who you are. So in 2014 you revealed publicly that you'd been having some mental illness challenges and been diagnosed with that. That seemed to me, I was surprised. I would have never expected that. And what was that like for you to publicly, come out in a way, and deal with that publicly? And why was it important for you?
Yeah, and it is, I came out with writing a post about it. I wrote a sort of an essay, and the headline was, screw stigma, I'm coming out, because it is a coming out, and it's very much like any other part of ourselves that we decide we're afraid to reveal. So I think people who have mental illness are really, really good at hiding it. They use tremendous amounts of energy to conceal it from people. And that's why a lot of times you only find out after the fact that someone was suffering, and then you only learn there was a problem when they die. I put a lot of energy into this idea of what I wanted people to see of me, and that was the most important thing. So I was on when I was on, and the rest of the time I was more of a mess. And but deciding to reveal that was scary. And the important thing is that it was not anything as I thought it would be. I anticipated that I would be, I don't know, criticized, or I don't know what I thought would happen, but none of that happened. In fact, what did happen was I heard from a lot of people that I had known for many years who said, yeah, me too. Uh-huh. And I said, wow, okay, I didn't know that. And they didn't know that. I didn't know that. So it's a shame that we separate mental health from physical health, and nobody ever thinks they're going to get looked at differently if they end up having kidney disease. But it's like you have a mental health illness, and suddenly it's like, well, they're going to judge me for that. And I think that people in news, you and I just talked about being trusted to handle the big story. Well, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, will I still be seen as the person you can trust with the lead story, the person you can put in, in a hurricane, in a tense situation, the person you can send on an overseas trip and know they'll do fine. If in the back of their mind, this is me thinking, uh-huh. They're thinking, I don't know, I don't want to set him off or have him in trouble. I think there's a lot of worry about whether you will still be seen in the same way and still be trusted. And so people keep these things secret, and then that, of course, makes it worse and worse and worse. And it's not a good thing. But it was a great thing that happened, and never regretted it.
It was, I assume it was liberating in many ways after you got past your own initial fear of what's going to happen.
Yeah, because then I could talk about it, then I could talk about it and own it. And then I could be, for people who weren't comfortable talking, the person who can. So, I used that platform on Twitter to engage, to share things, to say things that maybe other people wouldn't feel comfortable saying. And one of the areas that I focused on was how, reporters like myself tell stories and the language they use when they cover mental illness. Because one of the big issues is the fact that we use some really ancient language around mental health that reinforces all of the stereotypes about it and makes it really hard for people to feel safe. I think in the piece I wrote, I said something like, I can remember having conversations in Miami in the newsroom with people about having to go in to get a colonoscopy. But we would never talk about, taking an antidepressant how many people take antidepressants? It's like, in your world, there are a lot of people who are, but you would never talk about it. But you'd be fine talking about this thing that's really unpleasant and kind of disgusting to think about.
And very
it's like, I'm like, what is that? What kind of world is that where that's one thing we're fine talking about, but this other thing is not? And so I tried to be as vocal and outgoing as I could.
And go ahead, Bobby.
I was just going to ask, since the time that you spoke about your story, do you feel like it's gotten to a point now where people are a little bit more open and comfortable talking about those things, or is there still kind of an unspoken stigma around it, do you think?
I think there's still a lot that needs to change. There's some of the things that we feel okay saying when we talk about mental health, mental illness, that we would never say about other things. And, if you think about it, any story about, we talk about people having their demons. It's like, what do you mean by that? I mean, what are the demons that he was battling demons? It's like, no, he wasn't. He was sick. He wasn't battling demons. That goes back to the Middle Ages when, when if you were mentally ill, you were basically put in chains and locked away. I mean, and I really think a lot about why we have such antiquated language and we still feel okay about it. And most of the reporters and anchors and producers that I've known are really smart people, and I consider myself one of them. And yet I know that if I were to look back at some of the stories I wrote, I am sure I would find things that I would be mortified by. But when I see a story that I think wasn't as good as it could have been, I reach out and I say, like, that wasn't great. And I've written a few things. After the shooting, the mass shooting in Las Vegas, I wrote a piece that for the Dallas Morning News, where I talked about there was just this, and it's just common sense. It just kind of goes to how we feel inside when something that we can't explain happens. We want to have an explanation. We want to say that the person is crazy. We want to say the person's insane. We want to say they're deranged. We want to use these words. And even though we don't know if the person was any of those things, we don't know anything about their mental health, but we know they did something that's horrifying and makes us angry. And the language that's used in news conferences when we know nothing about who did it is all about, this lunatic, this madman, this crazy person did this. And I think, the thing I wrote in that piece was, what are my kids going to think one day? Is like, is daddy like that guy because he takes medicine, And I just believe that if you don't know something about a person's, we're very careful about talking about people's physical illnesses. We don't say things if we can't say for sure, if we don't know it. We have a lot of rules about that in the newsroom, but we're really loose with things like, unhinged, crazy, anything that suggests that they're not healthy in their head. And I think we need to be just as careful in that way.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I think that's a good point, and how you talk about how when you hear it or see it, you address it, which I think is important because, like you were pointing out, I think a lot of that stems from just these words and these phrases that have kind of somehow embedded themselves like in our vernacular. And I think a lot of that comes from ignorance, but in our business, there should be no room for ignorance. I think, we're in the business of swashing ignorance for others. So we can't really
right. And I think sometimes we don't like to say that we don't know something.
Yeah.
The Las Vegas shooter, if you go back and look at that, they're still really not clear on what happened there. They still don't have an answer. And it isn't that he had any diagnosable mental illness. They're really like at a loss. I mean, and I think that, you want to have an outlet for the way you feel, and you want to like grab people like that by the shoulders, and you want to scream in their face and say, how could you be such a horrible person? And you have somebody like the president who uses the language of mental illness to attack his political enemies. Mm-hmm. He constantly talks about, especially women reporters, he talks about them being, unhinged or lunatic. He has gone after like Mika Brzezinski and used the language of mental illness because he doesn't like the things she's saying. And that just tells people, we've seen what happens with the things he talks about and how it invites people to do more of the same with hate speech and all of that stuff, racism. And it's the same with mental illness. He uses those words to attack people. And that's the kind of stuff that makes it really, really hard for people who might otherwise confide in a coworker and say, I'm having trouble to do so, because they don't want to be associated with any of that stuff.
I thought it was the 2 points from that article you did for the Morning News was the fact that we want to disassociate ourselves with these shooters and these people, and because no quote sane person or rational person could do such a thing, which seems like a natural response. But then when you look at it in the bigger picture of other people, and then you talked about your daughter seeing you take your medicine every day, and is someday she going to say, "Is my dad like that too?" Or capable of that too? And that's an unfair, you know, we're maligning people that are unfairly and putting them in these categories. So I think it is very important. You're right, and we don't always think about that. So thank you for bringing those points out and making us all aware of it. And I watched your speech at the National Council on Behavioral Science last year, and I thought that was really interesting in there, and how you talked about those languages and stereotyping and the damage and the bias that it actually does to people, and keeps that conversation from happening, and makes people kind of, in some ways go back into the closet, if you will, and not want to talk about their own issues because they don't want to be, vilified or cast in that same light. So I thought it was really profound. You talk early in that speech, in that talk, about how you were out with the military. You were on something. They asked you if you wanted to drive the tank.
Yeah, it's one of the things I like to tell students, that you'll be confronted as we all know that local reporters always end up dressing up as firemen at some point for some reason. But there are other opportunities that come to you, and when this was, just to date me, this was the first Gulf War. Okay, so this is 1990.
Used to be the young guys in the newsroom.
So I had been in TV like all of a year and a half at this point, and it was one of those things where, we were starting to, because I was working in Savannah, Georgia, and so there's a big military base outside of Savannah, and there was a lot of buzz happening that something was happening, that we were getting the sense that the 24th Infantry Division was going to be activated. So this photographer I worked with, who was one of my all-time favorite photographers, said, we have to have passports. We've got to have passports. So we took time out of a day when we were supposed to be reporting and got passports. And a few weeks later, the news director comes to me, and it turns out that he had gone down the list of people that he was going to send overseas, and nobody had passports. So the guy who just showed up from Grand Junction, Colorado, he's like, "Mark, do you have a passport?" I'm like, "Yep." He's like, "You want to go to Saudi Arabia?" I'm like, "Yep." And so one morning I was getting dressed to go to work, and to get this phone call, and it's this guy on the other end of the phone, and he's like, "Mark Joyella?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "There's a sergeant somebody at Fort Stewart." I'm like, "Okay." He's like, "What size uniform do you wear?" I'm like, "What? I don't know. What are you talking about?" And he's like, I'm like, "What? How do they go? Like a medium, large type of thing, or suit size? How do you do it?" And he's So I told him my height and weight, whatever. He's like, "And I suppose you don't know what size helmet you wear?" I'm like, "No." And I don't know why I didn't think to call the newsroom right after that. But I get to work, and the news director's like, "Yeah, you're leaving today." So I'm like, I got one, my dog. I gotta go home. And so we flew out there, and we're in the desert one day, and these guys are bored. They've been waiting for something to happen for the longest time. And the guy's like, "You want to drive the tank?" And I immediately in my head, I start going thinking of everything that could go wrong if I did that. And I'm like, am I supposed to? Is that wrong? Would my news director be mad at me if I drive the tank? What if I wreck the tank? What if, and I'm so busy in my head, the moment passes, these guys have moved on to something else, and it never happened. And so after that, I was like, okay, forget that. I am not doing that again. So they're like, "You want to fly in the F-16? Yes." They're like, "You want to learn how to swallow fire at Coney Island at a freak show?" Yes. We were we were in Miami one time. They sent us down to Key West. There was a hurricane, I think, in Honduras, and there was some horrible little plane that they had packed with relief supplies. And it was such a scary plane that I remember when the photographer and I were walking to the tail of the plane to sit down, our feet it was squishy, the floor. It was they kept sticking to the floor. I'm like, this is not good. And at one point we're flying, and this little light says, "Go see flight crew." I'm like, what does that mean? So I go up there, and the guy's like, "How's it going back there?" I'm like, "Good. I don't know." "You want to fly the plane?" "Okay." So the guy, co-pilot, climbs out. I climb in. He's like, don't tell anybody about this. I'm like, nope, I won't. But, so I try not to let my fears like mess up good experiences.
I would have done the same thing, though. I think I would have been very hesitant to drive the tank. And now I think that's just part of being young too, though. There's a certain amount of that. Now I would totally do it.
Right. Why wouldn't you?
Right.
You should have a tank.
Exactly.
You should actually have a tank.
Why would I not?
Yeah. I like the concern, though. That one of the concerns was that you were worried about wrecking the tank. And it's like, if you wreck the tank, then the country has bigger problems.
Right. It's like, how do you wreck a tank in a desert? It's like, what do you do?
Yeah. If you're going to wreck the tank, they're probably going to promote you.
I'm not going to hit. Like, what am I going to do? Crash it into another tank? I don't know. What? Yeah, I don't know. But that's what I thought.
Yeah. That's why I had an opportunity to rappel off a building. I'm like, hell yeah, I'm going to do that. And I didn't want to do it. And I was very nervous about doing it. And then when you're doing it, you have to stand on the edge of the building and he goes, lean back. I'm like, no.
Right. Lean back and then push your feet.
Right.
Wait, what now?
Yeah. This does not seem like a reasonable thing to be doing, but it was great. And you just have to kind of lean into that discomfort and, push yourself. Right. But shortly after you came out in a way, you left local news. And why did you decide at that point, instead of, and I'm not criticizing it, but instead of staying and being an advocate inside a newsroom or inside the business and stuff, that you decided it was time for you to go a different direction?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that was also just being afraid. When I decided to write that essay, it was basically because a story had gotten to me, a story that I had, introed on the weekend morning show. And because of the format of the show, it was like this 5-hour block of news, and I would just read the same story over and over and over again. And the way we had reported the story, just each time I watched it, I got more upset. And to really give you the short version of it, it was basically a story about this man who had gone missing, and the people who he had rented a room from went in his room, and they said, we found his some notes he left, and he had made some YouTube videos where he talks about God, talking to God, and that there's going to be Judgment Day, and he may have a gun. And so we basically presented the story as if it was a threat to the community. This is we got to get this guy. He's crazy. He's armed, and we need to be careful. And, when you really think about it, if you look at the truth of people like that, the only person who's really actually in danger is that person. They almost always end up being the victims. This wasn't somebody who was in danger, and nobody said he was a danger. And not to mention the fact that you can't just go interview someone's landlord and get a medical diagnosis from someone's landlord. That not only is that like completely a violation of anything that any privacy they may be entitled to by going through their property, but it's just not right. And I was like, why did we make this guy into a criminal, a caricature, a dangerous character, when we could have said, this is a guy who's probably needs to be located and get some help. And I started to write my news director an email saying, I think we should talk more healthily about this type of stuff in the newsroom. And then right before I sent the email, I got nervous about what it would mean. Why are you so interested in this? I didn't want to have to answer that question. So I didn't send it. And then I felt terrible about it later. And that's what led me to do it. But by that time, my wife and I had already sort of concluded that we wanted to be closer to home. My mom at the time was toward the end of her life and was sick, and we just wanted to be closer to our family, and so we had decided to come back home. And just at that point, it became very easy for me to just sort of shift gears and to sort of walk away from it. But yeah, it was. I do think that newsrooms need those people that are willing to stand up in the morning meeting and say, "Why is that a story exactly? Are we sure about that? Because that sounds kind of wrong." let's think about that one. It just takes one person to be that voice, and I think that's important. And I think that's the same for a lot of issues. We need somebody who can stand up and do that. And when we talk about race, we need, all of these issues. We need to make sure that somebody is able to advocate for those things, because it just takes one person's ear to notice that maybe that's not what we want to do with this tremendously powerful tool we have, of television.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think that's always the great thing about a newsroom. I feel like is we all have different experiences, and we have different life experiences and different backgrounds, and just different perspectives, and all those voices are important, and we have to listen to all of them. And it may decide we do a story or we don't do a story, but it also may change how we do that story or how we tell that story. And I think that's really important. And we all learn something from it too. Well, yes, you're right, Mark. There are a lot of smart people in our business, but sometimes we just get caught up in the machine, and we need that one person to go, hey, what about?
Right. Yeah. And sometimes, it's the knowing the perspective of somebody else, because you can't presume to understand. And, we all have to, I think if there's anything that this year has taught us, is that we need to be aware of our experience is not necessarily everyone else's experience. And sometimes, we just feel like, oh, I know every man because I'm a regular guy. It's like, yeah, you are, but you're also a white guy, and you're a white guy who grew up in Connecticut. So you have a pretty specific kind of everyman that you are completely well-versed in understanding what that person might think, but you are probably not the best source to decide if this is a great way to tell that story. And so I think it doesn't have to always be a reporter that can be the person who covers it, but maybe a reporter who goes, would you read this and tell me if this sounds right? Or if I'm doing anything that's going to make somebody mad or upset or feel bad, am I going to offend anyone if I say this? And I think having a diverse newsroom makes it really easy, because then you've got a person right there you can go to and say, hey, would you read this for me? And they go, see this where you said that people hate it when people say that. Oh, great. This thing you said? Yeah, that's not, we stopped saying that like 15 years ago. Okay. So don't do that.
It's true. We all have to continue to evolve, but it is that conversation of, what I feel like I've learned this year is to slow down a little bit and to listen a little more, to be a little more patient with people and hear their stories. And it's hard. I mean, we do a lot of, we meet multiple deadlines every day. There aren't a lot of jobs where you're hitting all those deadlines every day, and it is a rush, and you have to be quick, and you have to be, nimble about doing your job. And so it's hard sometimes to do that. You've written things, and you come out and like, wow, I wish I hadn't said that, or hadn't written it that way, or the good thing is, you do have multiple eyes sometimes, and things get changed and get caught. So that part is good, but it's a challenge.
The speed thing is funny, because specifically going from working in Florida. Miami was the ultimate example of this. Orlando, not quite as much, but the pace of news coverage in Miami was just unlike anything else in my entire career. Even New York City was nothing like that.
No, it's insane.
And
not to use a bad word. I should have said that word.
to go, that's okay. To go to like a corporate job, and I remember like one of the first days, they're like, "Hey, can you write this story about blah blah, something happening in the company?" And blah. I'm like, how long will that take? I was like, I don't know, about an hour. And they're like, and you could tell they were like, he doesn't understand what I'm asking. They're like, how many like days/weeks will that take? I was like, what? What are you talking about? I'm like, here's the person. I call the person. And they're like, no, you don't. You email the person's assistant and their comms person, and then you set up a call to talk about talking to the person. And I'm like, oh, I get it. This is a different world, and it's going to move much more slowly. I'm going to have to adjust to this. It was weird.
Was that frustrating? Because I feel like that would be frustrating to me.
It was frustrating at first. Yeah, it was hard, very hard to adjust. I sometimes felt like I didn't even know what I was doing. And, but at the same time, the good part for me is it's always good for me to feel like I don't know what I'm doing, because then I feel like I'm learning something. And I like sort of being out of my element a little bit and then trying to figure it out. And I look back a few years into working for a tech company, and I happen to be talking to somebody about something, and they're like, "Man, you really seem very authoritative on talking about Agile." And I'm like, I guess I've learned a lot. It's like you just pick things up. But yeah, I always wondered. I was like, why don't corporations hire more reporters? Because we're good storytellers. It seems to be obvious that would be. And I think the problem is that there's this culture that's very different, and probably it's not such an easy transition. And it certainly wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. It's a lot more understanding how things work and how to do things. And it's not as, I saw this thing on Twitter the other day. Somebody was talking about a reporter, how reporters are. And it's so true. They said, reporter, yeah, can I do an interview with you about this thing, say in about, 3 minutes at your house? And we feel totally comfortable doing that. Oh, you're a senator? Oh, fine. Hey, can you talk to me? When? I'm outside your house, And then, but PR people email reporters, and they're like, "Oh, sorry, I missed your email from 7 weeks ago. What did you want to ask me?" It's like, we're like,
I'm not available right now, but in 7 months. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, I agree with you. And that's an interesting perspective on it, because I always think that the skills that we have and we learn would translate to other businesses. But I guess the challenge is working within that culture and that environment, which is just so vastly different from what we do. Right.
But once you sort of get your feet wet with, I imagine it's like moving from the military into civilian life, or any of these other transitions that you make. You have to understand the language, and you have to understand sort of how things work. Once you get that, then the skills that any storyteller has are super valuable. And I have times where I'm talking to somebody, and you can hear them trying to sort of wrestle with how they pull this stuff they have into something that is a story that somebody would want to actually hear. And then when you do that, they act so appreciative. They're like, "Wow, oh my God, thank you so much." I can't tell you how many times people say, "Oh, you're gifted." I'm like, please, that's like, you don't do that. But at the same time, I realize that it's not a skill that is usually, that people regularly find in a corporate team. So it is kind of fun to be the person that they go like, "Could you make words out of this that people read well?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I can do that."
Bobby's sick of hearing this, but it's craft, and to be good at craft, you have to practice it.
Yeah, it was. I always like trying to figure new ways of doing stories. And one of the things I did recently was I went back to school, and I got a master's in narrative nonfiction. And one of the first things that happened to me was this program at the University of Georgia was basically, the idea was, we're going to tell true stories in a literary way. And I had only written stories in a TV news way. And so I couldn't understand what they were even talking about. They're like, narrative arc. And they talked about, characters instead of interviews, and all the language was different. And the first thing that I worked with somebody who had worked at CNN, and she was able to help me sort of detox from news writing, TV news writing. And she's like, take a story that you did for Day of Air, and then try and write this way with it. And I realized, like, I have nothing. And it's funny because, in TV news, we are so based in getting the element, the most basic stuff, because we don't have any time, so we have to get the basics, the crisp, really, it's like poetry. It's like the fewest words possible into that like 50-second package, or the 115 or whatever it is. But when you try and write a story that says, like, the wind swept through the oak leaves of the mud oak that grew, 100 feet tall outside, it's like, I don't have any detail. I was like, I can't write anything. And they're like, she's like, now you know how to do. Now you have to go back and report something and I was like, man, you got to write down a lot more notes to do this. It's going to take a whole lot more writing than I've ever done before. But it was good because I felt out of my element again, and I really liked that.
So it's the fundamentals are the kind of the same. You're still telling the story. It's just how you're telling the story.
Yeah, it's just like it's like, right. It's basically, putting a character in their environment, and like writing a really rich magazine profile kind of a thing, a really good story that reads like a book, but it's true. And, you just really describe the scene. And the only time you have a quote is if it's actually said in that place. So you don't just, in other words, describe a place, then you have a quote from someplace else that applies. It has to be said there. It's like just like reading a book,
Yeah.
and but it took a long time to unlearn what I had learned, as Yoda would say, and learn this new way. And but then when I got it, I really started to enjoy writing that way, which you can't do obviously for TV. But again, the fundamentals are still there, like you said. It's just still knowing when you're, say, at a scene, what those the details are that are telling, knowing how to describe a person, knowing, the things that they getting them to reveal themselves to you, all that stuff that is the same no matter what you do.
Well, thank you for some time today. Be safe.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Catching up. Thanks so much. At Stand Up Kid on Twitter.
At Stand Up Kid on Twitter.
Thank you.